4,000 gold ducats. 60 muscular oxen. It sounds like a standard invoice from a merchant's ledger in the late Middle Ages, doesn't it? Just numbers on a page. But history is never just numbers. History is the specific temperature of human blood cooling on a marble floor. Those 4,000 ducats were not for grain or silk. They were the price paid to a Hungarian engineer named Orbán to build a monster. And those 60 oxen? They were required just to drag that monster across the mud to the gates of the world's greatest city. The result of that transaction was not profit. It was the morning of May 29th, 1453. If you were standing inside the great church of Hagia Sophia on that morning, you would not be praying. You would be screaming. The air was thick with a copper scent of fresh slaughter. The holiest sanctuary in Christendom, the very navel of the world, had been breached. On the high altar, where emperors had been crowned for 1,000 years, the chalices were overturned. But the red liquid pooling on the white altar cloths was not the wine of Christ. It was the blood of the priesthood. Nuns, who had spent their lives in silence and prayer, were being hunted down the aisles, their habits torn from their bodies by men who saw them not as brides of God, but as the spoils of war. This is the image we must start with. Not the glorious maps, not the noble portraits, but the reality of a massacre where the sacred mingled with the profane in a horrifying slurry beneath the golden mosaics. It is the primal truth that we often look away from. When the walls fall, faith does not stop the steel. But to understand how we arrived at this moment of absolute violation, we must rewind. We must step out of the church and onto the ramparts 53 days earlier. Before the silence of the dead, there was the thunder of the living. The fall of Constantinople did not begin with a whisper. It began with a sound so loud it reportedly caused pregnant women in the city to miscarry from the sheer vibration. It was the voice of the basilica, the great Bombard, a cannon so massive it defied the laws of physics known to the medieval mind. For over 1,000 years, the triple-layered Theodosian walls had stood as the ultimate shield. They had broken the teeth of Persians, Avars, and Arabs. They were the reason the Byzantine Empire had outlived Rome by a millennium. They were considered indestructible. But Mehmed II, the young Sultan whom history would call the Conqueror, did not care about tradition. He cared about ballistics. Imagine standing on those walls. The stone beneath your feet is vibrating, a low-frequency hum that travels up through your boots and rattles your jaw. You look out across the fields, and you see it. The barrel is 27 feet long. The stone ball it fires weighs 600 kilograms, heavier than a grand piano. When the fuse is lit, the explosion is not just a sound, it is a physical blow to the chest. The air compresses, the ground heaves, and then the impact. When that stone ball strikes the limestone and brick of the Theodosian walls, it doesn't just chip them, it pulverizes them. Ancient masonry explodes into a cloud of deadly shrapnel. Dust chokes the air, coating your tongue with the taste of pulverized history. The defenders, citizens who are not soldiers but bakers, scholars, and monks, rush to the breach. They scream instructions over the ringing in their ears. They throw whatever they have into the gap: mattresses, barrels of earth, bundles of wool, anything to absorb the kinetic energy of the next shot. It is a desperate, pathetic attempt to bandage a mortal wound with household linens. This was the new reality of warfare. The age of chivalry of knights and swords and high stone towers, was ending in a cloud of sulfur smoke. The Middle Ages were being executed by gunpowder. Inside the city, the psychological terror was absolute. Every time the cannon fired, the people crossed themselves, whispering, "Lord, have mercy." But the walls kept crumbling. The psychological anchor of their world, the belief that Constantinople was under the protection of the Virgin Mary, was being dismantled, stone by stone, by a 21-year-old Sultan who understood that artillery speaks louder than prayers. The sheer scale of the bombardment was designed to do one thing: break the mind before it broke the body. And as the dust settled on the first days of the siege, the people of the city looked at the horizon and realized the terrifying truth. The world outside had changed. The technology of death had evolved. And they were trapped on the wrong side of history. And standing on that crumbling edge was a figure wrapped in the weight of a dying legacy. If you looked closely through the dust and the smoke of the bombardment, you might not have recognized him as a monarch. His armor was dented. His face was gaunt, etched with the insomnia of a man who knows the hourglass is running out of sand. But there was one detail that betrayed his station, one flash of color amidst the gray stone and the brown mud. The boots. He wore the imperial purple buskins, embroidered with double-headed golden eagles. These were the shoes of a Roman emperor, the symbols of a lineage that stretched back to Augustus and Constantine the Great. But now, in the spring of 1453, they were walking through rubble. This was Constantine XI Palaeologos, the 88th and final emperor of the Romans. Historians often paint him as a tragic hero, a statue in a museum. But we must see him as a man who woke up every morning to the sound of his own city being dismantled. He was not ruling an empire anymore. The vast territories of the Byzantine Empire had shrunk down to this: a city, a few islands, and a title that meant nothing to the cannons outside. He was essentially the mayor of a graveyard waiting to happen, and he knew it. From his vantage point on the walls, Constantine could see the futility of their resistance. It was a heartbreaking sight. Between the bombardments, when the great cannons needed to cool, the people of Constantinople would rush out like ants to repair the damage. But they had no stone. They had no mortar. So they used what they had. They filled the gaping wounds in the Theodosian walls with barrels of earth, with bales of wool, with tapestries torn from the walls of palaces, and even with mattresses. Imagine the desperation. Trying to stop the most advanced artillery in the world with bed linen and garden soil. It was a patchwork defense, holding together only by the sheer refusal to die. And then there were the numbers. The emperor had ordered a census, a secret count of every able-bodied man capable of holding a spear. The result was a secret so devastating, he forbade it from being made public. In a city that once housed 500,000 souls, the defense force consisted of only 4,773 Greeks, just under 5,000 men. Even with the 2,000 foreign mercenaries, brave Genoese and Venetians led by the expert commander Giovanni Giustiniani, the total force was less than 7,000 swords. Constantine had to look out at the horizon and see the reality facing those 7,000 men. Stretching from sea to sea was the Ottoman army, 80,000 regulars, perhaps 20,000 irregulars, and a fleet that choked the waters. The odds were not just bad, they were mathematical impossibilities. It was 10 to 1. Yet the emperor did not flee. He had been offered safe passage. The Sultan Mehmed II had sent messengers. Surrender the city, take the Muraya, and live out your days in luxury. It would have been the rational choice, the logical choice. But Constantine wore the purple boots. And in the logic of kings, you do not trade your capital for a retirement villa. You trade your life for your people's time. The nights were the hardest. While the Ottoman camp was ablaze with thousands of fires, alive with the sound of drums and prayers, Constantinople was dark. They were saving oil. They were saving candles. The emperor would walk the walls, his purple boots stepping over the sleeping bodies of his exhausted soldiers. He was waiting for a sail on the horizon, waiting for the fleets of Venice, waiting for the Pope to rally Christendom. He was waiting for the world to remember them. But the sea remained empty. The courts of Europe were busy with their own squabbles, their own indifference. Slowly, the cold realization settled into the emperor's bones, colder than the night air off the Bosphorus. No one was coming. The ghost of Rome was alone, and the wolf was at the door, hungry, young, and armed with fire. The wolf at the door did not just bring fire. It brought a soundtrack of absolute terror. If isolation was the cold knife in the emperor's back, the noise was the hammer crushing his skull. We often watch history in silence, reading words on a page. But the siege of Constantinople was a sonic torture chamber designed to break the human mind long before the walls gave way. Day and night, the defenders on the ramparts were subjected to a psychological weapon the world had never truly heard before: the Ottoman military bands, the meter. Imagine the sound of hundreds of heavy drums, the davul, beating a rhythm that mimics the human heart in panic. Boom, boom, boom. Overlaid on this was the screech of the zurnas, shrill reed pipes that sounded like screaming eagles piercing through the thickest stone. And then, the voices. Tens of thousands of throats chanting the name of God in unison. Allah, Allah, Allah. It was a wall of sound that rose from the Ottoman camp, rolling over the city like a physical wave. It was designed to ensure that no one inside Constantinople could sleep. No one could think. No one could forget, even for a second, that the end was coming. Inside the walls, the soundscape was a tragic opposite. There was no martial music. There were only the bells. The mournful, desperate tolling of church bells, calling the faithful to the Hagia Sophia for yet another liturgy. The air inside the city did not smell of gunpowder. It smelled of incense and fear. People whispered in the streets, trading rumors like currency. They said the water in the cisterns was turning red. They said the icon of the Virgin Mary had slipped from its frame during a procession, a terrifying omen that the Mother of God had abandoned her city. The sensory overload was suffocating. The smell of unwashed bodies in armor, the stench of rotting offal thrown over the walls, and the constant, rhythmic thud of the Turkish miners digging tunnels beneath the foundations. Digging, scraping, scratching. The sound of your own grave being excavated while you are still standing on top of it. In this crucible of noise and sleeplessness, a moment of silence arrived. It came in the form of a messenger. Sultan Mehmed II, perhaps respecting the bravery of his enemy, or perhaps simply wanting to preserve the architectural jewel of the city from looting, made a final offer. It was a cold, rational business transaction. The message was simple. Constantine could leave. He could take his court, his treasures, and his family. He would be given safe passage to the Peloponnese, where he could rule as a minor governor under Ottoman protection. The citizens would be spared the sword if they surrendered immediately. The city would be taxed, yes, but it would not be sacked. This brings us to the precipice of the human soul. Constantine XI sat in his palace, the Blachernae, looking out at the Golden Horn. He was exhausted. He was likely starving as he shared the rations of his men. The offer on the table was seductive. It was logical. It guaranteed life. It guaranteed the survival of the Palaiologos bloodline. All he had to do was hand over the keys. All he had to do was admit that the math was against him, that 10-1 is a losing bet, that God had chosen a new master for the Bosphorus. Most rational men, most modern politicians, would have taken the deal. They would have called it negotiating for peace. They would have spun it as a humanitarian victory to save the population. But Constantine looked at the messenger and delivered a reply that echoes through the corridors of time. He did not speak of safety. He spoke of duty. He said, "To surrender the city to you is beyond my authority or anyone else's who lives in it. For all of us, after a mutual decision, shall die of our own free will without sparing our lives." He chose certain death over a living compromise. He chose to be the tombstone of an empire rather than the survivor of its funeral. Now I want you to stop. I want you to take a breath and place yourself in that room. Forget the history books for a moment. Look at your own hands. Feel the pulse in your wrist. You are Constantine. You are wearing the purple boots. Outside, 80,000 men are sharpening their blades to kill you. You have a ship waiting in the harbor. You can get on that ship tonight. You can live for another 20 years. You can see the sunrise tomorrow in safety. Or you can stay. You can walk out those doors and be hacked to pieces. Your body thrown into a pile of anonymous corpses. Your head mounted on a spike. But you will keep your honor. Ask yourself the question that haunts the dark. If you were him, would you really have stayed? Are you the hero who dies for a symbol? Or are you the human who lives for tomorrow? Because until the sword is at your throat, you never truly know. While Constantine prayed in the dark, kneeling on cold stone, his enemy was wide awake in a tent of silk and gold. History often makes the mistake of painting villains as mindless barbarians, brutes who conquer through sheer force and ignorance. But the man waiting outside the walls of Constantinople was neither ignorant nor a brute. He was perhaps the most dangerous kind of predator. A genius with a singular obsession. Mehmed II was only 21 years old. In the courts of Europe, they laughed at him. They called him the boy Sultan. They thought he was a rash, inexperienced child who would break his teeth on the walls of the city, just as his father had done. They were wrong. This 21-year-old spoke 6 languages. He read the biographies of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar in their original tongues. He studied geography, mathematics, and philosophy. While the Christian kings of the West were holding tournaments and feasting, Mehmed was studying the blueprints of ballistics. He was the prototype of a Renaissance prince. But his art was not painting. His art was siege warfare. In the silence of his command tent, Mehmed was not sleeping. He rarely slept. He was consumed by a concept known in Turkish lore as the red apple, Kizil Elma. It was a symbol of ultimate power, the elusive prize of world domination. For centuries, the red apple had been Rome. Then it became Constantinople. To Mehmed, the city wasn't just a fortress. It was a destiny that had been promised to him by the prophet himself. He believed he was the instrument of God, sharpening the blade of the Ottoman Empire rise to strike at the heart of Christianity. But his faith was backed by cold, hard engineering. Witnesses describe the Sultan spending his nights bent over parchment, his hands stained with ink. He wasn't just ordering his generals to attack, he was designing the attack himself. He drew the topographical maps of the city's defenses. He calculated the trajectory of the cannonballs. He understood the physics of the walls better than the men who were defending them. This was the core of the terrifying Mehmed II tactics, a fusion of religious fervor and scientific precision. He treated the siege not as a battle, but as a mathematical equation. The walls were a variable. The hunger of the defenders was a variable. The arrival of Venetian ships was a variable, and he was solving for X. There is a chilling story that captures his temperament during these nights. One evening, unable to rest, he summoned his Grand Vizier, Halil Pasha, a man who had often argued for peace. The vizier, terrified and trembling, arrived with a bowl of gold coins, thinking the young sultan's restlessness was born of greed. Mehmed kicked the bowl aside. He looked at the old man with eyes that burned with a feverish intensity and said, "I do not want your gold. I want the city. Give me that one thing." He was a man who would execute his own soldiers if they showed cowardice, yet he would pay a fortune to an artist or a scholar. He was a complex, terrifying paradox. And as he stood outside his tent, looking up at the silhouette of the Hagia Sophia against the moonlight, he didn't see a holy sanctuary. He saw a throne room waiting for its new master. The boy sultan was done playing. He was ready to end the Middle Ages. But for all his calculations, for all his maps and his gunpowder, Mehmed II faced a problem that mathematics could not solve. It was a problem of geography. Constantinople is shaped like a triangle, a shark's tooth jutting out into the water. On the landward side, the double Theodosian walls held firm against the bombardment. But the other two sides of the city faced the sea. To the south lay the Sea of Marmara, where strong currents made a naval landing nearly impossible. To the north, however, lay the Golden Horn, a calm, sheltered harbor that led directly to the city's soft underbelly. The seawalls along the harbor were weak, single-layered, and low. If the Ottoman fleet could enter the Golden Horn, they could assault the city from the rear, stretching the defenders until they snapped. But they could not enter because of the chain. The Great Chain of Constantinople was not a metaphor. It was a literal, physical monstrosity of defensive engineering. Massive links of cast iron, each the size of a man's torso, were strung across the mouth of the harbor, floated on giant wooden logs. It stretched from the Tower of Eugenius on the city side to the sea tower of Galata on the northern shore. It was heavy, cold, and slick with the algae of centuries. When the waves rose, the chain groaned, a low metallic growl that sounded like a beast guarding its lair. Behind this iron curtain sat the imperial fleet, a handful of Venetian and Genoese galleys, tall-sided and deadly. As long as that chain held, the Golden Horn was a sanctuary. The defenders on the weak sea walls could sleep at night. For weeks, Mehmed's admirals tried to break it. They rammed it. They tried to saw through the wood. They tried to grapple it. But the chain held. It was the ultimate "do not enter" sign posted by the Roman Empire. And to make matters worse, the waters outside the chain became a stage for Ottoman humiliation. On the 20th of April, a small flotilla of 4 Christian ships appeared on the horizon. 3 were Genoese, carrying weapons and soldiers from the Pope. One was a Byzantine transport carrying grain. Just 4 ships. Mehmed, seeing an easy victory, ordered his entire fleet, over 100 vessels, to intercept them. What followed was not a battle. It was a collision of eras. The tall Christian ships, built for the rough Atlantic, towered over the low Ottoman galleys. From their high decks, the sailors in armor rained down arrows, stones, and Greek fire upon the exposed Turkish rowers below. It was a slaughter. Mehmed watched from the shore, and this is where we see the cracks in his cold, calculating mask. Witnesses say he went mad with rage. He screamed orders that could not be heard over the din of battle. He spurred his white horse into the surf, riding until the water reached the saddle, as if he could physically will his navy to victory. He shouted curses at his admiral, Baltoglu, calling him a coward and a woman. But his shouting changed nothing. The 4 ships, battered but triumphant, caught the wind and sailed right up to the Great Chain. The defenders lowered it just enough to let them pass, then raised it again, shutting the door in Mehmed's face. That night, the mood in the Ottoman camp was poisonous. The defeat was a disaster for morale. The fall of Byzantine Empire seemed less like a prophecy and more like a delusion. The Janissaries muttered in the dark. The viziers whispered that the siege should be abandoned. Mehmed summoned his admiral, Baltoglu, and ordered him to be beaten with a golden rod in front of the troops, stripping him of his rank and his honor. But punishing a man could not punish the sea. The Sultan retreated to his tent, humiliated. He stared at the map. He stared at the Golden Horn, that tantalizing strip of water that mocked him. He realized that as long as he played by the rules of naval warfare, he would lose. The chain was absolute. The sea was against him. So, in the flickering light of an oil lamp, the young Sultan decided to do something that no sane commander would ever consider. If he could not sail his ships through the water to get around the chain, he would have to find another medium for them to travel on. He looked at the steep forested hill of Galata that separated his fleet from the harbor. It was high. It was rugged. It was covered in brush and stones. It was land. And he decided that his ships would sail over it. The plan was insanity. In any other era, under any other commander, the officers would have mutinied. To move a fleet of 70 warships over a mountain of steep, forested terrain was a fever dream, not a military strategy. Yet, in the darkness of April 22nd, the impossible began to move. The preparations had been frantic and covert. Thousands of laborers were drafted to clear the brush and level the ground. They laid down a wooden road, a track of heavy planks stretching from the Bosphorus up the steep slope of Galata and down into the Golden Horn. But wood against wood creates friction. To solve this, the Ottoman quartermasters raided every market and storehouse in the camp. They requisitioned tons of olive oil, mutton fat, and lard. The road was slicked with this nauseating mixture until it shimmered in the torchlight. The air reeked of rendered fat and sweat, a thick, greasy smog that clung to the skin of every soldier. Then the ships arrived. They were not dismantled, they were hauled whole. Great wooden cradles had been constructed to hold the hulls upright. Oxen were harnessed to the front, their eyes wide with panic in the flickering light. Behind them, teams of hundreds of men grabbed the ropes. The movement began. The sound was unearthly. It was the screaming protest of wood grinding against wood, a high-pitched keening that echoed off the hillsides. Above the mechanical noise rose the rhythmic chanting of the haulers and the sharp crack of overseers' whips. It was a scene from a nightmare. Imagine standing in a quiet forest at midnight and seeing a warship, fully armed with cannons and masts, gliding past the tree trunks. The leaves brushed against the hulls where barnacles still clung. The absurdity of it was total. Ships are creatures of the sea. Seeing them navigate a hillside was a violation of the natural order.
For the Genoese observers in the neutral tower of Galata, looking down on this procession, it must have looked like witchcraft. They watched in stunned silence as 70 vessels, galleys, fustas, and brigantines climbed the hill one by one. The rowers sat at their benches, not rowing water, but rowing the air, moving their oars in rhythm to help balance the ships as they lurched over the rough terrain. The sails were furled, the flags fluttered in the night breeze, and the entire fleet migrated across the land like a herd of leviathans migrating across a desert. By the time the sun began to bleach the sky over the Golden Horn, the operation was complete. The citizens of Constantinople woke up to their usual routine. They went to the seawalls, expecting to see the empty, safe waters of the harbor, protected by their invincible chain. Instead, they saw the impossible. The Ottoman fleet was there, right in the middle of the Golden Horn. 70 ships were anchored in the calm waters, their cannons already swiveling to point at the city's undefended underbelly.
The psychological impact was devastating. The chain, that massive iron guarantee of safety, was still intact, still locking the front door. But Mehmed had simply smashed through the back wall. The realization rippled through the city. There is no safe place left. The harbor walls were weak. The garrison was already stretched thin on the land side. Now, they had to pull men away to defend the sea. The noose had tightened. The water, once their friend, had turned traitor. And as the Ottoman sailors washed the grease and mud from their decks, they looked up at the terrified faces on the walls and laughed. The laws of nature did not apply to them. They served a sultan who could make ships sail on land. With the Golden Horn lost, the noose around the city's neck was complete. The defenders on the walls could now look in every direction, north, south, east, west, and see only the preparations for their own death. But humans are resilient creatures. When the physical world becomes a prison, we escape into the spiritual. The people of Constantinople, starving and exhausted, told themselves that walls might fall and chains might break, that God would not allow his city to perish. They believed in the prophecies. They believed that if the enemy ever breached the walls, an angel of the Lord would descend at the column of Constantine, flaming sword in hand, and drive the invaders back to Persia. This belief was their final fortification. It was impenetrable. Until the sky itself turned against them. On the night of May 22nd, the final week of the empire began with a sign that froze the blood of every man, woman, and child who looked up. The moon, rising full and bright over the Bosphorus, began to darken. It was a lunar eclipse. But to the terrified citizens below, it was not an astronomical event. It was a celestial verdict. They watched in horror as the shadow crept across the lunar surface, turning the pale light into a sickly, bruised red. The blood moon. For the Byzantines, this was the ultimate omen of doom. There was an ancient prophecy that said Constantinople would never fall while the moon was waxing. But now, the moon was dying. And worse, the shape of the eclipse looked like a crescent, the symbol of Islam, devouring the light of Christendom. Panic spread through the streets faster than the plague. Desperate to regain the favor of heaven, the emperor and the patriarch ordered a massive procession. They brought out their most powerful spiritual weapon, the icon of the Virgin Hodegetria. This was not just a painting. It was believed to have been painted by Saint Luke the Evangelist himself. It was the protector of the city, the leader of the way, the sacred talisman that had saved them from sieges for centuries. 4 strong men carried the massive icon on a wooden litter, surrounded by a throng of weeping faithful. They marched through the streets, chanting, "Kyrie eleison," Lord, have mercy. They believed that if they paraded the Virgin along the walls, her gaze would turn the Ottoman bullets to dust. But the Virgin did not look at the enemy. She looked at the mud. As the procession wound its way through the crowded, rubble-strewn streets, the unthinkable happened. Perhaps the bearers were weak from hunger. Perhaps the ground was slick with the oil and grime of the siege. Without warning, the heavy icon slipped from their grasp. It did not float. It did not emit a holy light. It fell like a dead weight. It struck the ground with a dull, heavy thud, face down in the filth. A gasp of absolute horror went through the crowd. Men rushed to lift it, but the chronicles tell us that the icon seemed to have become supernaturally heavy. It took the strength of dozens of men to pry it from the mud, as if the Virgin herself was refusing to rise, refusing to defend a city that was already marked for the grave. And then, as if the theater of cruelty needed a final act, the heavens opened. The moment the soiled icon was raised, a storm of biblical violence erupted. It was not a spring shower. It was a deluge. Hailstones the size of walnuts battered the faces of the priests. Thunder drowned out the prayers. The streets turned into rushing torrents of gray water, forcing the procession to abandon the ritual. The people ran for cover, soaking wet, shivering, and spiritually shattered. The message could not have been clearer if it were written in fire across the sky. The Hodegatria had fallen. The moon had bled. The sky had wept. God had left the building. Inside the palace, Constantine XI stripped off his wet clothes. He must have felt the crushing weight of isolation. The walls were crumbling. His allies were few. And now, even the saints were silent. The psychological defense of the city had been breached. The people stopped looking for angels. They started looking for hiding places. And outside, under the clearing sky, Mehmed II looked at the same moon and smiled. He didn't need omens. He needed only 3 more days. The end of the world was scheduled for Tuesday. The end of the world was scheduled for Tuesday, but the terror began on Monday night. As the sun set on the 28th of May, 1453, the sky turned a bruised purple, and a strange phenomenon descended over the Ottoman lines. For weeks, the nights had been filled with the sounds of drums, chanting, and the clattering of armor. But on this night, Sultan Mehmed II issued a command that was more chilling than any bombardment. He ordered absolute silence. Imagine it. 80,000 men, a city of soldiers, suddenly falling mute. No fires were lit, no songs were sung, no trumpets blared. The vast plain outside the walls became a pool of ink, a black void where death was waiting to be born. Inside Constantinople, the defenders strained their eyes against the darkness. They listened until their ears rang. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and physical. It was the sound of a predator holding its breath before the pounce. The psychological weight of this silence was unbearable. It stripped away the adrenaline of battle and left only the cold, trembling anticipation of the end. Every soldier on the wall knew what it meant. It meant that the preparations were complete. It meant that the next sound they heard would be the scream of the apocalypse. While the enemy waited in the dark, the city of Constantinople turned inward for one final, heartbreaking act of unity. For centuries, the Christian world had been divided. The Orthodox Greeks and the Catholic Latins had argued over theology, over bread, over the authority of the Pope. They had hated each other almost as much as they feared the Turks. But on this night, as the shadow of the scimitar loomed over their throats, the schism evaporated. The great bronze doors of the Hagia Sophia swung open. Into the vast candlelit cavern of the cathedral poured the entire soul of the city. It was a procession of ghosts. Soldiers in dented armor stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants in rags. Italian sailors stood next to Greek monks. There were no more Catholics. There were no more Orthodox. There were only men and women about to die. The patriarch and the cardinal celebrated the liturgy together.
Voices that had once argued, now blended in a single, desperate chant of Kyrie eleison. The golden mosaics of Christ Pantocrator looked down from the dome, illuminated by thousands of flickering oil lamps, witnessing the funeral service of an empire. In the center of this sea of weeping souls stood Constantine XI. He did not stand as a ruler above his subjects, but as a man among them. He walked through the crowd, stopping to embrace his commanders, his servants, and even his political enemies. Witnesses recorded a moment of supreme humanity that transcends the history books. The Emperor of the Romans, the heir of Augustus, bowed before his people and asked them for forgiveness. He asked pardon for any wrong he might have done them, for any tax that was too high, for any judgment that was too harsh. And the people answered him with wailing. The historian Francis writes that the sobbing in the church was so loud it could be heard outside in the streets. A collective cry of grief that rose up into the dome and, perhaps, reached a heaven that had already turned its back. After the service, Constantine rode his white horse back to the walls. He took his position at the St. Romanus Gate, the weakest point in the defenses, the place where the hammer would inevitably fall. He was accompanied by his loyal friend, the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani. Together, they looked out into the pitch-black void. The silence of the Ottoman camp was still unbroken. It was past midnight. The air was cool and smelled of impending rain. The emperor checked his sword. He adjusted the buckles of his armor. He looked at the few thousand men shivering on the ramparts, bakers, tailors, fishermen, holding rusty spears and looking at the dark with wide, terrified eyes. He knew that behind that curtain of night, the fuse was already burning. He knew that he would never see the sun set again. And then, at approximately 1:30 in the morning, the silence broke. It didn't break with a whisper. It broke with a roar that shook the earth to its molten core. The Tuesday of the end had arrived. The roar that shattered the silence at 1:30 in the morning was not a single sound. It was a cacophony of hell. Along the entire 4-mile length of the land walls, the darkness was ripped apart by the muzzle flashes of heavy artillery. The great Bombard, the basilica, coughed its massive stone lung into the air, smashing into the already crumbled fortifications near the St. Romanus Gate. But the cannon fire was just the percussion section. The melody was the scream of 50,000 human beings rushing forward at once. Mehmed II opened the ball with his pawns. These were the Bashi-bazouks. The name itself translates roughly to crazy heads or leaderless ones. They were an irregular force of mercenaries, criminals, and opportunists gathered from every dark corner of the East. There were Slavs, Hungarians, Germans, Turks, and even renegade Christians. They wore no uniform. They had no standardized armor. Some fought with scimitars, others with slings, some with nothing but rusty iron bars. They were not fighting for Allah or for the glory of the empire.
They were fighting for what they had been promised, 3 days of unrestricted looting. They were fighting for the gold in the churches and the women in the houses. But to the Sultan, they were not soldiers. They were biological debris. Their purpose was not to take the city. Their purpose was to die.
Mehmed used them as a human wave to absorb the ammunition of the defenders, to blunt the swords of the Greeks, and to fill the deep moats with their own bodies so that the elite troops could walk over them later. It was a tactic of supreme cruelty. Behind the Bashi-bazouks stood lines of Ottoman military police armed with whips and iron maces. If a mercenary hesitated, he was lashed forward. If he turned to run, he was cut down by his own commanders. They were trapped between the crossbows of the Byzantines and the scimitars of the Turks. The only way out was forward, into the meat grinder. On the walls, Giovanni Giustiniani and his men fought with the cold efficiency of professionals. For the first 2 hours, the defense held. The Bashi-bazouks swarmed up the ladders like frantic insects, only to be met with boiling oil, Greek fire, and heavy stones dropped from the parapets. The screams were deafening. Men fell from the ladders with their faces melted, crashing into the muddy water of the moat below. The defenders used primitive hand cannons, culverins, firing lead balls into the dense mass of flesh. At this range, they could not miss. Every shot tore through 2 or 3 bodies. The moat began to fill, not with earth, but with the dead and the dying. The water turned into a thick, red sludge. Yet the horror of the assault was its endlessness. As soon as one wave was slaughtered, another took its place. The defenders had no time to drink, no time to breathe, no time to reset their aim. Their arms began to burn with the effort of swinging swords and winding crossbows. The smoke from the black powder hung low over the walls, a choking, sulphurous fog that stung the eyes and obscured the enemy. In the confusion, you couldn't see the man you were killing. You just thrust your spear into the shadow that screamed. Constantine was everywhere. Witnesses describe him moving along the line, shouting encouragement, his purple boots slick with the blood of the enemy that had sprayed over the battlements. "You are the descendants of Romans," he cried. "You are the shield of Christ." And for a moment, against all odds, it seemed to be working. The Bashi-bazouks were breaking. Their morale, fueled only by greed, evaporated in the face of such stubborn resistance. They began to pull back, leaving thousands of their comrades rotting in the ditch. A cheer went up from the walls, a ragged, desperate cheer of victory. But the cheer was premature. As the Bashi-bazouks retreated into the darkness, the defenders looked out and saw that the night was not empty. The first wave had just been the rain before the storm. Emerging from the gloom, marching in perfect step, with heavy chainmail clinking in rhythm, was the second wave. These were not undisciplined thugs. These were the Anatolian regulars. They were fresh, they were well-armored, and they were disciplined. They stepped over the corpses of the mercenaries without looking down, their eyes fixed on the exhausted men on the walls. The emperor wiped the sweat from his eyes and gripped his sword tighter. The test had not ended. It had just begun. The Anatolian regulars were a wave of iron, heavier and harder than the first. For hours they hammered against the St. Romanus Gate. They fought with the discipline of professional soldiers, seeking gaps in the wall, exploiting the fatigue of the defenders. But the Romans held. Constantine's men, bleeding and gasping for air, managed to push them back. As the Anatolians retreated into the gloom, a strange, terrifying calm descended on the battlefield. It was now just before dawn. The sky was a bruised gray, weeping a light, cold rain that mixed with the blood in the moat. The defenders leaned on their spears, their chests heaving, their muscles trembling from lactic acid and adrenaline. They thought they had bought a moment of respite. They were wrong. From the darkness of the Ottoman lines, a new sound emerged. It was not a roar of rage, but a rhythm of doom. The Sultan's military bands, the Mehmed, began to play a different tempo. It was faster, sharper, a pulse that demanded action. And then, they stepped out of the shadows. The Janissaries. These were not men. They were the Sultan's own lions, the elite of the elite, the new troops. Most of them had been born Christians, taken from their families in the Balkans as boys under the blood tax, converted to Islam, and raised with only one purpose: to kill for the Padishah. They marched in perfect silence, a stark contrast to the screaming rabble that had come before. They wore pristine uniforms, not the scavenged armor of the mercenaries. On their heads, they wore the distinctive white felt caps, the berk, with a long sleeve of cloth hanging down the back to represent the sleeve of the holy man, Haji Bektash. In the dim light, those white caps looked like a sea of ghosts floating toward the walls. Constantine looked down and felt the blood drain from his face. He knew what this meant. Mehmed had played his final card. He had thrown the weight of the entire Ottoman Empire against a few hundred exhausted men. The Janissaries advanced at a run, but it was a controlled run. They moved as a single organism. When they reached the moat, they did not scramble, they flowed. They climbed over the piles of corpses left by the previous waves as if they were stepping stones. They scaled the ladders with the agility of acrobats and the ferocity of tigers. The collision on the ramparts was catastrophic. The defenders were exhausted, their swords heavy in their hands, their armor battered. The Janissaries were fresh, well-fed, and fanatical. They wielded the deadly yata'an, a curved short sword designed to decapitate, and heavy poleaxes that could cleave through a helmet like it was parchment. The fighting descended into a brutal intimacy. There was no room for tactics anymore. It was just skin against steel, breath against breath. A Genoese soldier would thrust his spear, only for a Janissary to grab the shaft with a bare hand, pull the defender close, and drive a dagger into his throat. Amidst the slaughter, the unthinkable happened. Giovanni Giustiniani, the brilliant Genoese commander who had been the backbone of the defense, the man who had personally held the line for 53 days, fell. A projectile, some say a bolt from a crossbow, others a lead shot from a culverin, pierced his armor. It struck him in the shoulder, shattering the bone and puncturing his lung. The giant of the defense crumbled. He was bleeding profusely, his face turning the color of ash. His men, seeing their invincible leader fall, froze. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the heart of the defense. Giustiniani, in agony, begged to be taken off the wall. Constantine pleaded with him, grabbing his hand, begging him to stay, knowing that if the commander left, the morale of the troops would leave with him. "My brother," the emperor cried, "do not abandon us!" But the pain was too great. Giustiniani was carried away through the streets to a ship in the harbor. The sight of the Genoese commander retreating was the signal the Janissaries had been waiting for. They sensed the hesitation. They smelled the fear. With a collective roar that drowned out the thunder, they surged forward. They were no longer fighting an army. They were butchering a panicked crowd. The line broke. For the first time in 1,000 years, the enemy was not just at the walls. They were on them. The white caps of the Janissaries flooded the ramparts like foam on a breaking wave. The city of the world's desire was now open. The walls were breached, but the city had not yet fallen. In the chaos of close-quarters combat, a battle is often just a series of isolated duels. A soldier fighting for his life does not see the whole map.
He sees only the blade in front of his face. At the St. Romanus Gate, even with Justiniani gone, the remaining Greeks were fighting with the desperation of men protecting their wives and children, just a few hundred yards behind them. They were holding. They were dying, yes, but they were making the Janissaries pay for every inch of stone.
But while the eyes of history were fixed on the great cannon and the main gate, the fate of the Roman Empire was being decided by a mistake so small, so trivial, that it almost feels like a joke written by a cruel god. About a mile to the north of the main fighting, there was a small postern gate known as the Kerkoporta. It was a minor exit, half buried in the ground, used for sorties, quick raids where defenders would slip out, attack the enemy flank, and slip back in. It was not a grand entrance, it was a service door. And on this morning, amidst the confusion and the noise, someone had made a catastrophic error. They had left it unlocked. Perhaps it was treachery. Perhaps it was simple human negligence, a soldier too tired to turn a key or too panicked to check the bolt. We will never know the name of the man who left it open, but we know what walked through it. A group of about 50 Janissaries, prowling the perimeter like wolves, looking for a gap in the fence, saw the door standing ajar. They must have frozen in disbelief. They approached it cautiously, expecting a trap. But there were no guards. There was no ambush, just an open door leading directly into the heart of the city. They slipped inside. Silence. They found themselves behind the main line of defense. They climbed the stairs of the nearest tower, their soft leather boots making no sound on the stone steps. They reached the top, killed the unsuspecting sentries, and then did the one thing that would shatter the spirit of the defenders more effectively than any cannonball. They raised the flag. Down below, at the St. Romanus Gate, the defenders were still holding the line. But then, a soldier looked up. He didn't look at the enemy in front of him. He looked back, toward the city he was dying to protect. And there, flying high above the ramparts, flapping violently in the wind against the gray dawn sky, was the crescent banner of the Ottoman Empire. The psychological effect was instant and devastating. In ancient warfare, the flag is the brain of the army. If the flag is flying, the city is safe. If the enemy flag is flying, the city is dead. A cry went up. It started as a murmur, a confused question, and then it swelled into a scream of absolute despair. "He polis haloken! He polis haloken!" The city is taken. The city is taken. That cry was the end. It wasn't the slaughter of the soldiers that ended the battle. It was the collapse of the narrative. Why fight for a city that is already lost? Why die for a wall that has already been bypassed? The discipline of the Roman army, maintained for 1,000 years, evaporated in a single heartbeat. Men threw down their spears. They turned their backs on the Janissaries. They didn't run to fight another day. They ran to save their families. The defense of Constantinople didn't end with a bang. It ended with a panic. The cohesive shield of the army shattered into thousands of terrified individuals, running blindly through the streets, while the Janissaries poured over the walls like a river bursting a dam, cutting down anyone with a back turned. The irony was bitter and absolute. The greatest fortress in history fell not because of the giant cannon, but because of an unlocked back door. In the midst of this deluge of panic, where thousands of men were throwing down their weapons and trampling each other to flee, one man stood like a rock in a rushing river. Constantine XI Palaiologos watched the banner of Islam rise over the tower. He watched his soldiers dissolve into a mob. He heard the screams of his people rising from the streets below. At this moment, The universe offered him one last chance to survive. The Golden Horn was still chaotic. A small boat could slip away. He could flee to Italy. He could live in exile, a king without a crown, pitiful but breathing, telling stories of this day to bored courtiers in foreign palaces. But the blood of the Caesars does not run to safety. The emperor looked at the few faithful men remaining around him, his cousin Theophilus, the historian Francis, and a handful of Spanish nobles. The look in his eyes was not fear. It was a terrifying clarity. He realized that his life and his city were inextricably bound. The thread of one could not be cut without severing the other. He turned to them and delivered a sentence that burns with the heat of a dying star. "The city is fallen," he said, his voice steady amidst the roar of the slaughter. "And I am still alive." It was an unbearable contradiction. How could the emperor exist if the empire did not? So, he decided to correct the error. What followed was a ritual of reverse coronation. With calm, deliberate movements, Constantine began to strip away the symbols of his office. He unclasped the heavy purple cloak, the paludamentum, which had marked the shoulders of Roman emperors for 1,000 years. He let it fall into the bloody dust. He tore off the golden insignias, the double-headed eagles that screamed of power and lineage. He cast aside the jeweled brooches. He was dismantling his own identity. He was shedding the weight of the state so that he could die with the lightness of a soldier. When he was finished, he looked like any other man on the wall, anonymous, expendable, just a gray figure in dented armor holding a sword. But there was one thing he did not remove, one detail he forgot, or perhaps chose to keep as a secret signature for the afterlife: the purple boots. The boots embroidered with gold eagles still clung to his feet. They were the only tether left to the man who had been king. He drew his sword. It was not a ceremonial blade. It was a weapon of war, notched and stained from weeks of fighting. He turned to the few friends left beside him. "Is there no Christian here who will take my head?" he asked, a final plea to be spared the humiliation of capture. But they could not bring themselves to kill him. So he chose the enemy. "Follow me!" he shouted, not as a commander ordering a charge, but as a man inviting his brothers into the fire. And then, the last emperor of Rome ran. He didn't run away. He ran directly into the densest concentration of Janissaries pouring through the gate. He plunged into the sea of white caps and flashing scimitars. We do not have a clear picture of his death. There was no spotlight. There was no slow-motion fall. History loses sight of him the moment he enters the fray. He was swallowed by the violence. We can assume he fought. We can assume he took men with him. But ultimately, he was just one man against a tide of steel. A scimitar likely cut him down from behind. Another might have pierced his chest. He fell under the trampling feet of the conquering army, his body crushed into the same mud as the peasant soldiers he had tried to save. He died as he had lived, fighting a battle that was mathematically impossible to win, but morally impossible to abandon. In that chaotic, bloody mess at the St. Romanus Gate, the Roman Empire didn't end with a treaty or a signature. It ended with the sound of a single heart stopping under a pile of anonymous corpses. The head that had worn the crown was now just another broken skull in the dirt. But by dying, he achieved something that survival could never have given him. He became a ghost. He became the Marble King. And he left the conqueror with a hollow victory. Mehmed had the city, but he would never have the man. The emperor was dead. But for the citizens of Constantinople, death would have been a mercy. What followed the collapse of the walls was not a battle, but a harvest. The Ottoman army, fueled by 53 days of hunger, rage, and the promise of unimaginable wealth, spilled into the streets like a dark oil. And according to the ancient laws of siege warfare, confirmed by the Sultan himself, the city belonged to the soldiers for 3 full days. The stones belonged to Mehmed, but the people belonged to the sword. We often romanticize history. We look at the beautiful paintings of the conquest and see noble warriors on horseback. But we must strip away the varnish. The reality of those 3 days was a descent into a primal hell. The looting began instantly. It wasn't just a search for gold and jewels. It was a frenzied consumption of human beings. Men rushed into houses, dragging women by their hair across the floors where their children were crying. Nuns, who had lived their entire lives in the cloistered silence of monasteries, were stripped naked in the streets, their bodies fought over by soldiers like pieces of meat in a market. The air was filled with a sound that witnesses described as a unified groan, a collective vocalization of terror that rose from every corner of the 7 hills. The epicenter of this horror was the Hagia Sophia. Thousands of citizens had fled there, barring the massive bronze doors, believing that the sacred space would protect them. They huddled in the candlelight, listening to the screams drawing closer. But the doors of the great church were not made to stop axes. The wood splintered, the bronze gave way, and then the Janissaries poured in. Imagine the scene, the most beautiful interior in the world. The golden dome that symbolized heaven on earth, suddenly swarming with blood-soaked soldiers. They did not stop to admire the architecture. They stopped only to select their prizes. The old and the infirm were slaughtered where they stood. They were dead weight, worthless for the slave markets. The young, the beautiful, and the strong were bound with ropes. Priests were hacked down at the altar while still holding the chalice. The holy vessels were smashed, the jewels gouged out with knife points. The icons were used as chopping blocks. It was a complete inversion of sanctity. The house of God became a slaughterhouse. But amidst this chaotic violence, there was a specific, intimate tragedy that captures the true darkness of the conquest. It is the story of the Grand Duke, Lucas Notaras. He was the highest-ranking official in the city after the emperor. He was a man of immense wealth and influence, the one who had famously said he preferred the Sultan's turban to the Pope's mitre. When the city fell, Notaras did not fight to the death like Constantine. He surrendered. He believed that his rank would buy him safety. He believed he could negotiate with Mehmed, that there was a code of honor among rulers. For a moment it seemed he was right. Mehmed treated him with courtesy, sparing his life and the lives of his family. But the mercy of a conqueror is a fragile thing. The next evening, Mehmed held a victory banquet. The wine flowed. The adrenaline of the conquest mixed with alcohol. The Sultan, flushed with power and intoxication, decided he wanted entertainment. He remembered that Notaras had a 14-year-old son, a boy renowned for his extraordinary beauty. Mehmed sent a eunuch to the Grand Duke's house with a chilling command. "Send me your son for my pleasure." Notaras froze. He was a survivor, a politician, a man who had made deals with the devil to keep his position. But this was a line he could not cross. The demand was not political. It was a violation of the most primal bond of fatherhood. He looked at the eunuch and refused. "I will not hand over my own child to be defiled," he said. It was his first, and last, act of true defiance.
When the eunuch returned with the refusal, the Sultan's mood snapped from lust to murderous rage. He ordered the executioner to the Grand Duke's house immediately. Notaras and his 2 sons were dragged out, but Mehmed was not content with simple death. He wanted psychological torture. He ordered that the 2 sons be beheaded first, right before their father's eyes, so that the last thing Notaras would see on this earth was the extinction of his lineage. The Grand Duke knelt. He watched the blade fall. He watched the heads of his children roll onto the dust. And in that moment, the man who had tried to play both sides, who had tried to survive at any cost, finally understood the true price of defeat. He whispered a final prayer and stretched out his own neck. The blade fell, and back at the banquet, the Sultan continued to drink, the red apple now fully in his grasp, its taste sweet, metallic, and dripping with blood. The city was not just conquered, it was broken. The frenzy of the slaughter lasted for hours, but eventually, even the thirst for blood is sated. Late in the afternoon of that same Tuesday, a different sound began to filter through the screams. It was the sound of order returning to chaos. A procession of elite guards cleared a path through the corpse-strewn streets. The looting stopped. The soldiers, still covered in gore, lowered their eyes and sheathed their swords. The Sultan was coming. Mehmed II rode into the city not as a barbarian, but as a Caesar. He was mounted on a magnificent white horse, surrounded by his viziers and generals. He did not look at the piles of dead bodies. He looked at the architecture. He looked at the aqueducts, the columns, the fading glory of Rome. He rode straight to the heart of the city, to the great square of the Augusteum, and stopped before the bronze doors of the Hagia Sophia. This was the moment he had dreamed of since he was a boy. The red apple was finally in his hand. But as he dismounted, he did something that surprised his court. He did not stride in with arrogance. He knelt down. He took a handful of dust from the ground and poured it over his turban. It was a gesture of profound humility, a public acknowledgement that while he was the conqueror of the world, he was still just dust before Allah. It was a calculated performance of piety, signaling that the era of looting was over and the era of governance had begun. He stood up and walked into the cathedral. The air inside was still thick with the smell of blood and fear. A few terrified Greeks were still hiding in the shadows. On the marble floor, a Turkish soldier was hacking away at the beautiful mosaic pavement with an axe, trying to pry out a piece of marble as a souvenir. Mehmed drew his sword and struck the man flat with the blade. "Be content with the booty and the captives," he roared, his voice echoing in the vast dome. "The buildings belong to me." With that single strike, he transformed from a warlord into a landlord. He walked towards the altar. The space was immense, the golden mosaics of the seraphim glittering high above in the gloom. He climbed onto the holy altar, the very spot where the Christian liturgy had been celebrated just hours before. He looked out at the devastation, at the weeping captives, at his triumphant soldiers. And then, he performed the act that would seal the fate of the building for the next 500 years. He turned to the east, knelt down, and recited the first Muslim prayer ever heard in the Hagia Sophia. As he bowed his forehead to the stone, the transformation was instant. The Hagia Sophia was no longer a church. It was now the Hagia Sophia Mosque. The cross would come down, the bells would be melted, the icons would be whitewashed. But Mehmed did not destroy the building. He saved it. He recognized that to be the heir of Rome, he had to preserve its greatest symbol. He wandered through the empty halls of the imperial palace later that evening, reciting a melancholy verse from Persian poetry. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watches in the towers of Afrasiab. The conqueror was haunted by his own victory. He saw how fleeting power truly was. He had killed an empire, and in the silence of its empty halls, he felt the weight of the ghost he had just created. But ghosts, no matter how poetic, must be laid to rest.
For Mehmed to truly rule, he needed proof that the old landlord was gone. The rumor mill in the camps was already churning. Some said Constantine had escaped on a Genoese ship. Others whispered that he had been turned into marble by an angel and was waiting beneath the Golden Gate to reclaim his city. To kill the myth, Mehmed needed a body. The search began the next morning. It was a grim forensic operation. Squads of washermen were sent into the piles of carnage at the St. Romanus Gate. Their job was to wash the blood and mud from the faces of the thousands of corpses, looking for a man who might resemble a king. It was a needle in a haystack of death. Most of the bodies were mutilated beyond recognition, trampled by the stampede of panic, or crushed by the hooves of cavalry. The grandeur of the Roman Empire had been reduced to a pile of anonymous meat. Finally, they found something. Beneath a mound of slain Janissaries lay a headless torso. It would have been indistinguishable from the common soldiers around it, except for one detail that the looters had missed, or perhaps feared to touch. On the legs were the purple buskins, the imperial boots embroidered with double-headed eagles and golden thread. It was the only identification card the emperor carried. They brought the boots to Mehmed. He confirmed them. But a pair of boots is not a face. To complete the political theater, the Ottomans found a head nearby, hacked and battered, that matched the age and complexion of the emperor. They took this severed head, washed it, and presented it to the Sultan. Mehmed did not look away. He ordered the skin to be peeled back and the skull to be stuffed with straw. This macabre trophy was then mounted on a high column in the Augusteum, a public billboard of death for all the surviving Greeks to see. Later, it was sent on a tour of the major courts of the Islamic world, to Cairo, to Baghdad, to Damascus, as a tangible receipt of victory. "Here is the head of the Roman Empire," it said. "The debate is over." With the emperor dead and displayed, the transformation of the city could begin in earnest. Constantinople did not die in a single day. It was suffocated and then reborn as something entirely new. The change was visual, auditory, and olfactory. The bells, which had rung over the Bosphorus for a millennium, were taken down and melted into cannons. In their place, the muezzins climbed the highest towers. The first call to prayer, Allahu Akbar, that rang out over the 7 hills must have sounded alien and terrifying to the huddled Christians remaining in the cellars. It was the sonic branding of a new regime. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the artisans went to work. They did not destroy the great mosaics of Christ and the Virgin Mary. Mehmed was too cultured for simple vandalism. Instead, they covered them. Layer by layer, the glittering faces of the Christian God were plastered over with white lime. They were not erased. They were merely put to sleep, hidden beneath the calligraphy of the Quran. The great cross on the dome was pulled down, and a golden crescent rose in its place, gleaming in the sun that now shone on a Muslim capital. But history has a strange sense of humor. As the physical city turned east, its soul fled west. Thousands of scholars, artists, and philosophers managed to escape the siege on the Genoese ships. They carried with them the precious manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer, works that had been preserved in Constantinople while Europe was stumbling through the Dark Ages. These refugees landed in Italy. They brought their Greek fire of intellect to Florence, to Venice, to Rome, and there they sparked a new explosion.
The fall of Constantinople was the detonator for the Italian Renaissance. The death of the medieval world in the East gave birth to the modern world in the West. Mehmed had conquered a city, but in doing so, he had inadvertently enlightened his enemies. Today, if you book a flight to Istanbul, you will land in a city of breathtaking beauty. You will drink tea by the Bosphorus, watching the ferries cut through the same dark water that once held the Great Chain. You will walk through the Grand Bazaar, smelling spices and buying silk, surrounded by the vibrant noise of a metropolis that bridges two continents. It is easy to fall in love with Istanbul. It is a city of cats, of tulips, and of golden sunsets hitting the minarets. But if you take a taxi away from the tourist center, out towards the airport, you might catch a glimpse of something strange. Rising out of the urban sprawl of modern apartment blocks and highways, there are ruins. Jagged, broken teeth of stone, overgrown with weeds and covered in graffiti. Most people drive past them without a second glance, but you know what they are. These are the Theodosian walls. These are the stones that broke the armies of Attila the Hun. These are the stones that vibrated to the sound of the basilica cannon. If you get out of the car and walk up to them, you can still see the scars. You can see the charred sections where the Greek fire burned. You can put your hand in the crater left by a 600-kilogram stone ball. History often feels distant, like a fable written in a dusty book. We think of 1453 as a number. But when you touch those walls, the distance collapses. You realize that the layer of time separating us from them is paper thin. The ground you are standing on is not just dirt. It is a graveyard. Beneath the asphalt of the modern streets lie the bones of the Genoese sailors, the Anatolian infantry, and the last defenders of Rome. The screams that echoed on that Tuesday morning have faded, replaced by the sound of car horns and the call to prayer. But the energy of the trauma remains. It is trapped in the masonry. It is hiding in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, where the plaster covering the face of the seraphim is slowly peeling away, revealing the sorrowful eyes of the past, looking down at the tourists taking selfies. Which brings us to the final verdict. We started this journey by asking about monsters and heroes. We looked at Mehmed, the boy genius who drowned a city in blood to fulfill a prophecy. We looked at Constantine, the tragic king who chose death over safety. But history is rarely black and white. It is a deep, bruising purple. The fall of Constantinople forces us to confront a brutal truth about human civilization. Every great city is built on a crime. The beauty of Istanbul, the glory of the Ottoman Empire, the spark of the Renaissance, all of it was paid for with the massacre of May 29th. We enjoy the fruits of history, but we rarely acknowledge the fertilizer. We look at the conqueror and see greatness. We forget to look at the conquered and see humanity. So here is my challenge to you. The next time you walk through a historic city, whether it is Istanbul or Rome or London, don't just look up at the towers. Look down. Look at the ground. Ask yourself, who is buried beneath my feet? Because the story of the world isn't written by the winners. The winners just write the books. The true story is written in the silence of the losers. It is written in the empty space where a cross used to be. It is written in the memory of a pair of purple boots vanishing into a crowd of swords. Do not let their silence be absolute. Listen to them. Witness them. Because if we forget how easily a 1,000-year-old civilization can vanish in a single morning, we might not see the cracks forming in our own walls until it is too late. This has been the File on the Fall of Constantinople. But the story of the Ottoman rise does not end here. Mehmed II opened the gates of hell, but something else walked out of them. A young hostage, raised in Mehmed's own court, watched the fall of Constantinople. He studied the Sultan's cruelty. He learned the effectiveness of terror. And when he returned to his home in Wallachia, he would take those lessons and perfect them into a nightmare that would haunt the world forever. His name was Vlad. History knows him as the Impaler. You know him as Dracula. And in the next episode, we will walk into his forest of corpses. I am your narrator. This is BBM Historical Review. Close the file.